Welcome Internet. Today we're going to do something a little bit special because we're going to talk about the differences in the perspective and in the outcomes of drive theory in the US and in France. So very simply, what is drive theory? I'm going to start with that, the fundamental basics. Drive theory was a theory developed by Freud with the idea that in our minds, there is something that pushes us to do stuff. That pushing, that urge, is what he called drives. In certain early versions, he called it instinct, but he quickly let go of the word instinct to use the word drive. I think in German it's called Trieb. I'm not sure how you pronounce it at all, but you get the idea. It's the push. A push towards something. Towards an object, like the mother, the father, and so on and so forth, or internal, like the seeking to satisfy one's needs. So that's the fundamental core idea of the drive. The drive is something that pushes us. Later in life and in his theory, he divided two drives, the life drive and the death drive. So the life drive is our urge to seek pleasure, to try and survive, self-preservation, and in terms of species, it's our collective will to make everything last as long as possible and to try and ameliorate things for our whole species and to seek enjoyment. So it's a bit hedonistic. However, this life drive is counterbalanced by the idea of a death drive, i.e. something that seeks displeasure and in a way seeks our destruction, a form of pure intense destructivity, which civilization tries to contain by various means. But it's a drive, at least for Freud, that's inside of us and we are unable to completely wash it away. It's completely there, and like it or not, it has an impact on our minds. So this is the very, very, very basic theory of the drives within Freud's perspective. But what I found always very, very, very interesting is that when you read French psychoanalytic literature and American psychoanalytic literature, the interpretation of Freud's drive theories differ quite a lot and are quite significant. So I'm going to start with the US. The US has this very interesting perspective that the drives are inherently biological based. So it's never quite clear if they're genetic, if they're just body based, if they're inherently down to our very DNA, but there's this idea that it comes from the body. It's something that can't be changed. It's some bedrock of our bodies, of our who we are at a very primitive and fundamental way. Not to say in our advancements, but at the very core of our beings, biologically speaking, there is something that pushes. That push is nothing else than a biological construct to why we do things. So it's very interesting because in this version of things, there is no real agency. The drives are just there and they push, and we have to deal with that push, which is very, very interesting to me because the French have a ever so slightly different way of conceiving of things. For them, the drives are already something that's psychic based. It's not there is a link to the body, it starts in the body, but very quickly it's going to have a mind creation, which is very different. So it might seem like I'm playing on semantics here, but you have to understand that at their core, they imply very different things, both of them. For France and how the French thinkers, psychoanalytic thinkers, have developed it, is that drives are psychosomatic, meaning that there is the body, the implication of the body, yes, but very quickly there is the mind. And both are going to intertwine in this question of drives, meaning that drives are never purely biological, meaning, and this is very important, that they're not fundamentally linked to our DNA, to our ancestral behaviors, and so on and so forth. No. They're linked between that crossing point between body and mind. Yes, the body's there, but it's nothing without the implication of the mind itself. Which then puts the question of like, what are the drives fundamentally? So my perspective is very French. Like, I completely agree that there is no real biological necessity in the drives, if not for the mind. Like, it's the combination of the both of them that creates what we call drives. I feel that the American perspective is interesting because it like essentializes the drives, creates them as like some kind of given of existence, which might be true, but I don't think it's right to like give it this completely constitutional basis, as if there was no mind input into this, which is very interesting because fundamentally I feel that the French vision of it opens up to a more flexible understanding of drive theory, whereas the American perspective makes it more rigid, less integratable, which I think is very interesting because when we look at it, the French have, on the whole, I mean, there are exceptions, but have remained very, very loyal to Freud's drive theory. And when I mean that, like, I mean, if you're gonna, for example, talk about Fernburn, which virtually did away with drive theory, and you're gonna be met with a lot of skepticism and even cynicism on the part of French colleagues. Whereas in America, very quickly, people started to detach from it. For example, you have, Karen Horney that said, no, drives are not biological, they're cultural. People like Jung that wanted to expand the drives and the idea of drives. We have people like Rollo May that really wanted to expand the drives into an existential way, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very interesting point because I think that the flexibility the French gave to the idea of drives allowed it to be able to continue in theory, to be able to create a coherency in the theory, French theory, which allowed for everything to, in a way, fall into place, even though there's a lot of differences between, for example, Lacanians, psychosomaticians, Freudians, but they all agree on this idea of drives being at the core of everything. Whereas in the American schools, I have the feeling that it's much more ambivalent towards drives, as there's that push, in a way, to get rid of them or to just like consider them completely outside of the biological. Whereas the French, from the get-go, it is outside of the biological purely. It's a mix, a fundamental merger of biological and psychological, meaning there is no drive without the body, but there is no drive without the mind. That's a very interesting implication because whereas the Americans, at least from what I've read of their literature, there is this strange implication that the drives are not necessarily mind-based, that they just like something of the body that is completely fundamentally unaltered by the mind. Like the mind has to suffer through them in a way. That's not true in the French version of it. It's a niche detail, but something that I found so very interesting reading both perspectives. As a French psychologist, I was not trained to see it as biological, fundamentally. Whereas I have the feeling that Americans only see it as a biological phenomenon, which I find it fascinating how we can end up in two very different perspectives. Even though it seems that it's only playing on semantics, it's not. It's something that completely changes how you approach the idea of drives itself. And what I think, and this is my personal pet theory, right? I'm not sure that it's 100% accurate, but that's what I kind of think about it, is that perhaps the French translated very quickly, they quickly moved out of the idea that it was an instinct. As I don't know if you know, but the first translations of Freud in English translated the drives by instinct, whereas the French very, very quickly translated it by pulsion. So pulsion is the idea, it's like pulsation, right? It's something that pushes. So there's that idea of the push that very quickly came into French thinking. Whereas I have a feeling that in the Anglophone world, it was much, much more delayed, should I say. We pushed it a little too far away, meaning that it became an instinctual basis. And I think that because my teachers always insisted a lot on how drives are not instinct, and instincts are not drives. And I think that that very clear cut, because that's what it is in French theory. It's very clear that the drives are not instincts. There's something of the mind as much as there are from the body. Whereas I have the feeling that in America, the drives are the body. They are the DNA. They are the fundamental push of the body, and the mind has to deal with it. Fundamentally, I think that creates a merger between instinct and drive, which is a merger that did not last too long in France. As in France, there were translations and other translations in the official for Freud. So fundamentally, that dichotomy was able to be created in France, whereas in the US, I think there was a complete merger. At least that's my very, very personal pet theory to explain why the perspectives are so different. And I should add that I think that nowadays it's much more nuanced. Like the perspective on drives, it's more subtle than it has ever been in the US. As, for example, I'm using the word drive here, I'm not using the word instinct to talk about it. So that means that something has changed. So I think that maybe now it's much more, how can I say, flexible than it used to be. But what I'm interested in is how the French kept it flexible. And I find that very interesting. That in a way a difference is there, and it's very palpable when you read both literatures. It's not quite the same, and something I was very interested in talking about, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. So fundamentally, I want you to keep in mind that I am no scholar of like linguistics or like this very notion. It's just what I've read and what I've glued together. So there might be at a certain level some approximations or even things that I found out wrong. So don't take my word on it, do your own research, but that's my perspective. And if I'm wrong, just let me know in the comments. So if there's anything else, also let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.